Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for HASA's 7th Annual Symposium, Reconnecting. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anna Yermolina and I'm the president of the History of Art Students Association. I'm also a student at U of T and my last year of a double major in art history and English with a minor in environmental studies. I'm really happy and grateful that we're able to put this on for you all today. I'd like to start off by presenting our land acknowledgement. Traditionally, HASA opens its symposium by acknowledging the Indigenous territories on which the University of Toronto stands. And although we're not literally on campus right now, and perhaps not even in Toronto, we as an organization benefit from the physical space that the university occupies on unceded land, and we as art historians benefit in a myriad of ways from colonial exploitation at large. So we do want to take a moment to, at the very least, acknowledge that. And so we wish to acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes communally. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work and connect on this land. Slide. The symposium we're presenting for y'all today is a collection of some really excellent undergraduate art history research papers that have been selected in relation to our theme of reconnecting. Our journal, which publishes the complete papers from our presenters today, will be available online on our website come late April. So be sure to check that out when it's released. We wanted this theme and the discourse it generates to speak to how art participates in creating, upholding, or dissolving connections between both individuals and communities. These days, many of us probably realize the importance of connecting more than ever, as well as the weight of the absence of connection. Artworks, material culture, and museum and gallery spaces exist as spaces that can hold connections. Art is unique in its ability to help us witness, feel, and understand the spaces within and between ourselves, others, and the world around us. This year's theme invites exploration into the ways in which art does not exist inside a vacuum. We pose the questions, how do connections exist in the matrix of art, and how does art connect or reconnect us in the absence of connection? I want to give a few quick thank yous to everyone who's helped make this event possible. Thank you first and foremost to the faculty and administration of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto. We as HASA literally wouldn't exist without you, and neither would this event without all your incredible and generous support. Thank you also to Associate Chair and Director of Undergraduate Studies, Phil Saperstein, for being our faculty advisor in the editing of our journal papers and for supporting HASA outside of this event as well. A deep thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today to deliver what I'm sure will be some excellent presentations. We appreciate your time and being here and for all the hard work and patience in the editing process of the journal. A special thank you to Dr. Jordan Baer for honoring us with his keynote titled Beyond Our Eyes, Images at a Distance in 19th Century Visual Culture, which we're very excited to hear today at 3 p.m. Dr. Baer's lecture focuses on the range of 19th century strategies for representing phenomena that were too distant or too vast or complex for any single individual to observe with her own eyes. These developments require a different way of assessing the reliability of information received, not through face-to-face interaction with a known individual, but through an abstracted set of institutional authorities. An exploration of representations of a subset of inaccessible and counterfactual dimensions of the natural world, of exotic flora, the planet Venus, and sea serpents, helps to clarify the uneven historical ground upon which the trust of mediated representations has been tenuously erected. So thank you, Dr. Baer, for taking the time to share your research on this truly fascinating topic with us. We're also very lucky this year to be able to host an additional guest speaker segment. So thank you as well to 1919 for joining us at 1 p.m. today. 1919 is an independent arts and cultural production platform designed for Canada's Black and racialized communities. 1919 is a magazine, a radio, and an arts platform that organizes and produces works across their multidisciplinary platform that transforms spatial, physical, and digital boundaries through a lens that is radical, honest, and grounded in the rejection of oppressive institutions. Their talk today will go over their work that their platform does, the Black Printing Press, and grassroots art and movement building. Thank you, 1919, for taking the time to share about these important topics with us. And of course, thank you to my fellow HASA members who have volunteered their time and effort into the organization of this event and into the development of our journal. I certainly could not have done this all alone, and I very much appreciate the work that each of you has put into this. I'll now briefly go over how this event is going to work logistically, as well as some Zoom etiquette and that kind of thing, while showing you some lovely Google Stock images. I'll first bring your attention to the fact that this event is being recorded. We'll be recording up until about 3 p.m. just before our keynote, which will not be recorded. We'll be posting the recording up on our YouTube and linking to it from our website fairly soon after this event in case you'd like to watch it again, or if you want to share it with people who aren't here today. We have 7 student speakers presenting in 3 panels, as well as special guest presentation and our keynote. Each presentation will be introduced by a member of HASA, and the panelists will speak consecutively after one another, and then there will be an open audience question period monitored by a member of HASA. During the question period, anyone can feel free to vocalize a question by using the raise hand or the thumbs up function from the reactions at the bottom of your screen, or you can also type a question in the chat and we'll read them out. Depending on how long the question periods run, you can try to have, we'll try to have a short break where you can feel free to like stretch and refresh and do whatever you need to do. If the question periods start running long though, you should feel free to turn off your cameras and take a bit of time for yourself at your own discretion before the next panel, because as I'm sure we all know by now that long Zoom meetings can be a bit tough to sit through all in one go. And on that note about cameras, you are encouraged to turn yours on if you feel comfortable to do so, but please remember to stay muted unless it's your time to speak or ask a question. As I hope you've all seen, we do have a schedule posted on our website for how things are going to progress today, but we also are going to have the schedule displayed as a backdrop, as you see here, during the breaks, so you can keep track of when we're going to start up again. And with that, I think we're about ready to start. I'm going to pass this along to Iago, one of our co-conference chairs, to start off our first panel, and I hope you'll enjoy reconnecting.
Hi, everyone. My name is Iago, and I'm the co-conference chair for HASA this year, along with Bronwyn. And our very first speaker is Megan Kammerer, and Megan is an undergraduate student at U of T majoring in art and world history. She's also a Toronto-based researcher and arts administrator and has held various positions with the Jackman Humanities Institute, Robin McLaughlin Gallery, and the Blackwood Gallery, among others. She will be presenting her paper in defiance of bananas and duct tape, conceptualism, and Catalan's comedian. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you. I'm just going to get my screen share going. Perfect. I'm hoping everybody can see that. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you, Iago, for that wonderful introduction. My gratitude really goes out to the whole HASA team, as well as my fellow panelists. It's such a pleasure to be joining you, and to everyone joining us at home, thank you for taking time out of your precious Saturday to come check out some of our research. So to begin, the date was December 4th, 2019. And like every first weekend in December since 2002, hundreds of commercial galleries from around the world descended upon Miami Beach, all vying for a place among the rows of convention center exhibition booths that you now see on screen, and that traditionally make up the American iteration of a renowned collection of international art fairs known as Art Basel. Affluent crowds of patrons and everyday art enthusiasts alike quickly follow when doors open to the public for the fair's 4-day-long festivities. But this weekend, it was a little different when one Italian artist by the name of Maurizio Cattelan stuck a ripe banana to the walls of Gallery Perotin's exhibition booth. With a single strip of standard issue hardware store duct tape and a piece of fruit plucked from the local supermarket, Cattelan really sparked a discussion that led both art lovers and haters the world over to question the fundamentals of contemporary art. As I'm sure some of us remember, this banana duct tape combo quickly went viral as the spectrum of praise and criticism was quickly lofted towards the piece. Today, even, a quick scroll through the top comments on social media continues to reveal a whirlwind of responses. What a pitiful place art is headed. The wall deserved better. Pathetic, ridiculous, lazy, genius. It was a polarizing display, to say the least. Though it may prove impossible to reconcile with such a discourse, my work aims to examine and deconstruct these criticisms, to navigate the intense readership and media presence of Cat Lens Comedian, and to connect the work to late 20th century ideas of conceptualism, a sort of defense for the Basel Banana's rightful position in Western art history. Now, Art Basel Miami Beach has notoriously become a cultural event that is as well known for its poolside parties and cocktail-fueled evenings as it is about the sale of contemporary art. This is to say, a dressed-up banana is perhaps less out of place than it appears when its point of sale is rightfully recognized for its inherent spectacle. Cat Lens' installation is well situated in such an environment, equal parts critique as well as marvel among Art Basel's freakish sort of cultural wrap-up to the North American commercial year. Cat Lens fulfilled this sense of spectacle as the initial pairing of Comedian's 3 editions quickly sold to private buyers for $120,000 at the beginning of the weekend. Of course, this only fueled the attention surrounding this work. By Saturday night, a Georgian art performance artist by the name of David Datuna had even plucked the banana straight off the wall and consumed Comedian in a defiant intervention that he cheekily titled Hungry Artist. By Sunday morning, the artwork was then pulled from show as uncontrollable crowds, such as the ones that you see on screen now, began to threaten the safety of neighboring artworks. Yet despite its premature removal, the value of Comedian had soared as the weekend's theatrics increased, and its final edition was sold for $150,000. With a commercial story that was nearly as bizarre as the artwork itself, this iconic sculpture became a masterful player in Art Basel's inherent spectacle. Now, moving toward conceptualism, Comedian confronts spectators with many questions. Perhaps the biggest of all is how one could justify spending such a hefty sum on a seemingly inexpensive collection of objects. What does it mean to buy a banana and duct tape for so much money in this context? Well, the purchase of banana is really an investment into its authenticated idea. The physical form of the artwork is of limited relevance. This principle is grounded in 20th century theories of conceptualism, a modern cultural movement that was largely pioneered by the American artist Sol LeWitt throughout the 1960s. LeWitt was an advocate for ideas, as his theory strove equally toward a non-physical understanding of art via its concept. To LeWitt, a conceptual artwork is an idea. It is not physical in form, and it does not require any manual skill. The concept is ultimately the form of the artwork. Conceptual pieces of this type are often disseminated through a certificate of authenticity. The concept of the work or its intellectual content is then transferred to paper. Such certificates act as a physically marketable object that allows the work to be licensed and displayed. The certificate is what protects Comedian from the dangers of display, or even in the case of its first edition, digestion. So its fruity components can be replaced without loss in value all through this $150 certificate. These ideas align with another theorist's idea of conceptualism from the 1960s. Lucy Lippard proposed the dematerialization of art in 1968, wherein developing art practices were said to be entering a period of pure intellectualism. For example, Joseph Kosuls, titled Art as Idea, had already begun exploring immaterial ties between art and language, alongside John Baldessari's similar What is Painting. Both reconsidered the definition of art making by incorporating word and language into their practice. Lippard suggested that similar trends were causing a profound dematerialization of modern art objects, that the physical presence of conceptual artwork then acts as a mere jumping off point for deeper immaterial experiences of an installation. Now, some 50 years later, these pillars of conceptualism give Comedian its own footing within the contemporary art market. The conceptual underpinnings of the Basel banana are what make the work equally fascinating as well as maddening to many viewers, and that such a simple object can have a variety of interpretations that run the gambit between superficial gags and complex critique. The former can seem quite shallow. Like its namesake, Comedian is in part an irritating joke. The artwork teases many art enthusiasts who believe so-called good art should depend on tactical skill. It's not a highly technical work. After all, it is just a banana and duct tape. These concepts support common discourses against contemporary art, that it is unskilled, absurd, degenerate, superficial, the kind of idea that my child could make this sort of art. Comedians' supposed lack of integrity in this way is infuriating to many viewers, yet perhaps that's the entire point of the joke. Comedian mocks traditional audiences and laughs in the face of methodical art making. At the same time, Comedian is also a critique against the contemporary art market. It pokes fun at how susceptible buyers are to name recognition and hype. The marketability of this artwork is aligned with the established status of its creator, a prankster of sorts on the contemporary art scene. Maurizio Cattelan is the same artist, after all, who placed a replica of Adolf Hitler kneeling in repentance in Stockholm in a golden toilet titled America into the halls of the Guggenheim. He is aware he can exhibit Comedian through sheer will and social clout, and that the value of his work is bolstered by this familiar and comical canon that he has created. It is a funny little banana that at the end of the day can sell for 6 figures simply because of hype and clout. The outcry caused by this strange sculpture in the present art market begs more questions than I think are totally possible to unpack today. Are we taking ourselves too seriously? Can the artistic community that we are even navigating today at this conference simultaneously exist to challenge the notions of indexicality while really refusing to engage outside of the box at all? Comedian opens these disputes on satire versus critique, on funny versus serious, on bad versus good. It shows in the proper context, even a banana and duct tape can reveal the absurdities of Western culture, as well as the nonsensical inflation of commercial value. Though at times absurd and outlandish, Comedian is undoubtedly grounded in major histories of 20th century conceptualism. The artwork is connected to the theories of Sol LeWitt and Lucy Lippard as it challenges the viewer to turn inward and reflect upon the intellectual content of its installation. Comedian is a defendable player in contemporary art because it is conceptually all of these things. So today I suggest that Comedian should be defined and celebrated for its intellectual content rather than criticized for its mundane materiality. Of course, this does not mean it is any less ridiculous or that I think people should halt their long-winded rants against its absurdity on social media. In fact, in many ways, I think that is the most fabulous aspect of this artwork. This funny little banana will and has continued to play many jokes on us as viewers as it connects with a variety of aspects from modern art history. Today, I hope to have equally been as adequate in arguing more simply for its defense as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for presenting your paper. I will pass off now to Emily, who will introduce our next speaker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and I'm the co-vice president for HASA this year. Our next speaker is Eliza Faye Lafferty. Eliza is a member of Georgetown's class of 2021, graduating with degrees in art history and government with a minor in history. She aspires to be a community lawyer and advocate for minority populations in our institutions. And in the fall, Eliza will matriculate into Georgetown Law. She will be presenting her paper From Misrepresentation to Public Memory, Tracing Filipinx Visual Cultures and Curating the Vernacular Archive, which is the culmination of a 9-month research initiative as a Lisa J. Raines Research Fellow and is a part of her art history thesis. Welcome, Eliza.
Thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. Get started. Looks like everyone can see that okay. First of all, I want to once again say thank you so much, Emily, for that really kind introduction. Megan, that was a wonderful start to this panel and to this whole conference symposium. So thank you all. I'm very, very honored to be here, and I'm really grateful to be able to share an excerpt of my senior thesis work at Georgetown, which is called From Misrepresentation to Public Memory, Tracing Filipinx American Visual Cultures and Curating the Vernacular Archive. And before I begin, Anna started us off with a very thoughtful land acknowledgement, and I also want to acknowledge that I'm also a settler on Kumeyaay land right now. I'll be speaking about immigration, but I also recognize that my family did not immigrate to neutral land, and this will be significant to guiding the archive's decolonial, anti-racist, and restorative approach to history. Along with that, I want to offer this phone number as a resource. If you text your zip code to this, you'll be able to learn more about whose land you're on, and I'm also going to share this as a resource at the end as well. So for my thesis, I developed a digital archive of Filipinx Americans and their immigration paths from the Philippine Islands to the United States. It's called the Pakinggan Archive. I've included a screenshot of it on your screen. And Pakinggan in Tagalog means listen. And so in conjunction with the archive, I analyzed historical representations of Filipinx Americans from US imperialism to many waves of immigration in the mid-20th century to the present as well. Part of it I included an analysis I think would go along very well with Megan's presentation actually about Filipinx American modern art, including feminist performance art. But focusing on the archive, it's a collection of vernacular images, as in everyday homemade images vernacular. And it's over 200 photographs, including 6 families. You'll see a selection of them on the right-hand side of the screen, along with 2 curated exhibits, and it's still growing. And it has cross-curated themes, including service in the US Navy and Air Force, education, motherhood, fatherhood, religion, and the church. And creating the archive, I was guided by these questions, these 3 main questions. First, what is the relationship between religion, labor, and modern Filipinx American living? Second, how can we employ vernacular art and archival collections in the creation of spaces for maintaining and building Filipinx American public memory? And third, what languages for discussion, critique, and remembering does each artwork elicit? How can we approach these aesthetic forms? While answering these questions, I take an art historical approach with a focus on critical race theory and an archival approach as well, including the works of Roland Barthes, Tina Campton, Oakway, and Wazer. So these efforts that I've discussed so far are all in response to what I would characterize as public amnesia. Existing representations of Filipinx Americans are often impersonal and flattening. For example, what I've included on your screen is our nation's archive. If you were to search just for Filipino Americans, it includes little to no individualized information about Filipinx leaders, contributions to history, or nuanced narratives in any sense. Even if you look at just some of the earliest searches, it actually references Chinese Americans and immigration paths for Chinese folks instead of Filipinx Americans at all. But even if we were to look at a more nuanced, specific archive, James Earl Wood's collection of Filipinos in California from 1929 until 1934, still, despite this appearance of specificity, the images are still ultimately flattening. The images do not include personal details, narrative, or context about any of the individuals. There are very few captions, if any. And so many of the laborers that are pictured are nameless, or they're just images of the areas that they occupied, the lands that they worked on, the fields that they labored in, the houses that they lived in. And so these archives, like many others that exist, do not provide a dynamic representation of Filipinx American life in any sense, really. Going deeper into the James Earl Wood collection, for example, this image is from Wood's archive and is titled Snapshots of Laborers and Buildings, Location Unknown. It's an impersonal rendering of quite literally back-breaking labor. The laborers appear in rhythmic synchronization, and their pose is reminiscent of what I would tailor to Courbet's The Stonebreakers from 1850. In both of these depictions, the subject's bodies twist, tort, and bend to accommodate their labor. In both images, the stone and the ground that they work on nearly appears as the same color as the garments or the skin of the laborers themselves. And the laborers, through this knowledge, through this logic, might even appear as their work in this sense. In conjunction with this image of the laborers, Wood's archive includes this sign, a xenophobic sign from 1945. And the archive in no way addresses the sign or the xenophobia. It actually does not add any individuality, nuance, detail, context to the people behind the images. And so left unaddressed, the archive just reproduces and does not unsettle or disrupt this racist or colonial gaze. So in contrast, I present the Pakinggan archive, which actually creates space for very close personal analysis and hopefully the development of dynamic narratives about Filipinx American living. These are some of the images from the archive. They include captions, context, and stories about the images themselves. If we go ahead and read the images closely, we can recognize nuance, agency, and honor in the individual narratives. This is one of my favorite images from the archive. It's of D.G. Eligado from the early 1960s. And this was taken for his graduation from the Agricultural Engineering School in the Philippines. This was actually just a few months before he immigrated to the States.
because shortly after graduation from the school, the US government actually selected DG and 125 other graduates with him to immigrate to the States, a full ride to work in corporate America at the time. But upon arrival, despite their degrees, despite their expectations, all the graduates went to work picking vegetables in the Salinas crop fields. And so ultimately, he actually joined the labor movement with Larry Itliong and Cesar Chavez. And this history is oftentimes unrecognized, unknown, and his portrait shows DG's calm, determined gaze. The three-quarter pose is in tandem with his cap and gown, and our codes, visual codes, Barthian codes of DG's intelligence and power. Another image I want to acknowledge is of Emmanuel Villapando with his co-workers in the US Air Force. Emmanuel is in the front of the photograph, he's crouched, he's on the far right-hand side, and he's the only visibly Filipino man in the image, the only person of color in the image. And he seems pleased with his work. He's occupies an important part of the composition. He's nearly in the center of the work. And similarly to DG's photograph, these threads and narratives of individual stories develop the archive into a powerful addition to art historical vocabulary in the digital realm. So I'm going to continue developing this archive, and especially with a lens towards centering Indigenous voices as well. These are some more images from the archive, but while the Pakinggan archive is specific to Filipinx Americans, community-based vernacular archives are still so significant. And we each have our own personal archives in ways. We have collections of family photographs. We have our camera rolls of hundreds of photos of people, places that we love. And so I'd encourage you all in your own ways to embrace those images, and also to check out this hashtag, our personal archives, which is on Instagram and is a separate but related project that I'm working on, which is an initiative to center around individual storytelling and narrative control through images. And so I've included some contact information here and resources on the side as well. I'm very excited to talk with you all more and engage in conversation soon. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Eliza, for sharing your incredible project with us. I'm going to pass it on to Elena now to introduce Sasha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elena. I'm co-vice president of HASA. Our next speaker is Sasha Carnes. Sasha is a sophomore at New York University, majoring in data science and art history, with a focus on the intersection between these two fields, using the principles of data science to her approach to art historical inquiry and research. She will be presenting her paper, Progressive Deaccessioning, a Step Towards Museum Parity. Welcome, Sasha.
Hi, good afternoon. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here. Many thanks to the lovely introduction and to the University of Toronto and the team behind HASA for hosting such a great event. I'm really honored to be part of such a strong array of panelists, and I'm hugely looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentations. So through the next 10 minutes, I'm going to speak about the subject of progressive deaccessioning and share some of my research and reflections on the state of diversity and accessibility in American art museums. What kickstarted this line of inquiry in the first place was the very controversial attempt at deaccessioning at the Baltimore Museum of Art last October, so I'm going to use that instance alongside the BMA's first act of progressive deaccessioning in 2018 as a way to center those ideas and ultimately argue in defense of progressive deaccessioning. So to start, what is deaccessioning and what is its place in the modern museum? Deaccessioning is an essential practice that's been around since the inception of the modern museum. Put simply, to deaccession is to remove a work from your collection, most often through the work's sale. In principle, there should be a good reason for this removal, be it the work's redundancy to others in the collection, faltering quality, or questions about its attribution. On the screen right now, I have the American Association of Museum Directors suggesting considerations when kind of thinking through if a work should be deaccessioned. However, the danger of deaccessioning is always that any work being sold could be removed from public view forever. In the last few decades, the art world has come up with a strict series of rules and regulations that dictate exactly how the proceeds from a deaccessioning can be used. Prior to 2020, the American Association of Museum Directors, a key governing body in the industry, mandated that the proceeds of a deaccessioning could only be used to fund the care of a museum's existing collection or the purchase of more work. In April of 2020, however, amid unprecedented financial strains across the museum industry, the AAMD lifted these restrictions, allowing the museums to use the funds from deaccessioning for general operating expenses as well. Progressive deaccessioning has come to mean using deaccessioning to fix the gaping lack of minority representation in museum collections by selling the works of well-represented white male artists to acquire work of lesser-known artists from diverse backgrounds. However, it is a strikingly recent phenomenon, with the first recognized case occurring in 2018. The instances of progressive deaccessioning have come out of an industry-wide reckoning on the art world's long and terrible legacy of discrimination against women and people of color. Several recently conducted studies have revealed the staggering inequalities that continue to define art institutions across the country, and I'd like to highlight them here. For one, 85% of the artists represented in the collections of the 18 most influential art museums in the US are white, and 87% are men, an overwhelming majority that remained consistent across the surveyed institutions, regardless of whether their collections were based kind of in encyclopedic work or in contemporary work. The glaring inequalities do not end there. A survey of 179 American art museums in 2018 showed that while museum staff have become more racially and ethnically diverse over the past 5 years, people of color still make up just 28% of art museum employees and only 12% of museum leadership. A report issued by the American Alliance of Museums in 2017 revealed that nearly half of American museum boards are exclusively white, with only 10% of the surveyed museum directors indicating they had a plan in place to increase board diversity. All of these facets of inequality have converged to create a museum environment in which many potential visitors do not feel comfortable. Small-scale studies across the industry have found that as many as 40% of the American population does not feel welcome in art institutions, and that's a sentiment overwhelmingly held by people of color and lower socioeconomic status. Though all of this is problematic on an ethical level, the sweeping disillusionment across large sectors of the American population could pose a major threat to the survival of art museums going forward. Providing equal staffing opportunities for people of color within an institution is of vital importance to any improvement, but exhibiting artists traditionally left out of the art historical canon is also imperative. Only then will museums begin to reflect the true scope of artistic brilliance demonstrated by artists throughout history and appeal more broadly to the varied makeup of the specific communities they serve. Acquiring new art by women and people of color naturally displaces other elements of the museum's collection. In recent years, some institutions have made this exchange explicit through progressive deaccessioning, again, selling off the work by well-known artists to specifically finance the acquisition of lesser-known artists from minority backgrounds. Although these actions have predominantly fallen well within the bounds of standard industry guidelines around deaccessioning, they have nonetheless attracted considerable media attention and controversy. In the second half of this presentation, we'll examine the ideas and data we just discussed in the context of the Baltimore Museum of Art. The BMA was the first major institution to take up progressive deaccessioning, auctioning off 7 works from their collection with the expressed goal of acquiring more art by women and people of color in April of 2018. The demographics of Baltimore made these actions particularly necessary. Over 60% of the city's population is Black, and the median household income of $50,000 a year falls well below the national average of $68,000. Recalling the studies mentioned earlier, it is exactly these sectors of the population that often feel least welcome in artistic institutions, a finding that is reflected in the BMA's disproportionately small percentage of Black visitors from year to year. Though there has been marked improvement in recent years, the latest publicly available figure, 13% in 2015, is staggeringly low in comparison to the Black population of the city, which again is 60%. Without making sweeping changes to the BMA's programming and community outreach, it was clear that museum attendance would continue to falter and the BMA would fall out of relevance with the currents of the city. However, the ambitious changes mapped out by the BMA's leadership to improve its diversity and accessibility could only be executed at considerable expense. Deaccessioning became a critical tool for the BMA to advance its other social justice-oriented initiatives while also continuing to build a collection that improves minority representation and better reflects the constituents of the city it serves. Without deaccessioning, BMA Director Christopher Bedford shared, quote, "I did not see a way to fulfill all of our capital aspirations, exhibition-making aspirations, and raise money to be competitive in the contemporary art market. It wasn't a possibility," end quote. The works ultimately chosen to be deaccessioned were created by artists well represented in the BMA's collection who all identified as white men. Though deaccessioned with the overarching goal of funding the acquisition of new work by artists from diverse backgrounds, each individual artwork sold fulfilled the industry guidelines without this broader justification, chiefly on the grounds of their redundancy within the collection. To give one example among the few that I put on the screen, Franz Klein's Green Cross, which was painted in 1956, was very rarely exhibited in favor of another similar color painting from 1961 and numbered among approximately 12 works by Klein in the collection. So deaccessioning this work wouldn't meaningfully impact the museum's ability to, exhibit Klein's work and tell that story. Conversely, with the proceeds from the sales of the deaccessioned works, the BMA was able to acquire 9 new works, mostly by artists entering the BMA's collection for the first time. These acquisitions included 7 pieces by celebrated Black artists, and you can see some of them on the screen here. Their purchase markedly expanded the museum's ability to convey a more complete narrative of contemporary art while making strides towards the rightful recognition of minority voices in art. In October of 2020, the BMA announced what would become the most controversial instance of progressive deaccessioning yet. Spurred by the nation's reckoning with the murder of George Floyd and the amendments to the AAMD's guidelines in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the museum's board approved the deaccessioning of 3 paintings: 3 by Bryce Martin, 1957 G by Clifford Still, and The Last Supper by Andy Warhol, expecting a return of roughly $65 million. This enormous sum would be invested into improving diversity and accessibility across the museum, funding free admission, new acquisitions, as well as other diversity, equity, and inclusion-oriented programming and initiatives. However, despite the indisputable value of the outcomes of the deaccessioning, many prominent figures were angered by the method, inciting a media firestorm that ultimately led to the annulment of the planned sales and the reaccessioning of the works in question. Critics most objected to the prominence of the respective works chosen. On the screen, you can see a few of the initiatives that cropped up in opposition to the sale. The Warhol was among the museum's most famous, but again, was one of more than 80 works by that artist in the collection. The works by Martin and Still were the only examples of each artist's painting practice in the museum, but the BMA's collection included many similar works from the same movements, making them somewhat thematically redundant. This said, it's indisputable that these works were of more value, both sentimental and curatorial, than the ones the BMA had chosen for deaccessioning 2 years prior, and the case for their sale is harder to argue under the traditional deaccessioning decision-making framework. However, looking again to the staggering disparity between the representation of white male artists and artists of all other backgrounds in museum collections, it is clear that nothing short of radical action can begin to change it. Centuries of work by women and people of color has gone unknown or undervalued by the public on the basis of race and gender, projecting a clear message of exclusion to visitors and budding artists aligned with those identities. To not include these long ostracized voices is to risk losing the interest of an increasingly diverse American populace, and in the case of the Baltimore Museum of Art, continue to fail the majority Black population the museum was chartered to serve. Though the BMA was not ultimately successful in this deaccessioning, the museum's initiative marks a vital step into the next frontier of progressive deaccessioning, moving beyond the current guidelines and towards a greater prioritization of diversity, equity, and inclusion within museum collections. On the screen right now, you can see a few of the works that were accessioned in 2018, now in the galleries. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for that interesting presentation. So now I would like to open the floor for questions.
If you don't feel comfortable asking your question, you can always type it in the chat, and one of the HASA members will read it out for you.
I have a question for all 3 presenters. So obviously there's some beautiful resonances between all of your papers. And I guess specifically now we're kind of in a time where there's a lot of talk about deaccessioning major works or restructuring major museums, like most recently the V&A in London. So to all 3 of you, do you see kind of a breakdown of these larger institutions as kind of a carving out of space for more local and vernacular archives or projects? And I guess, how do you see the museum world changing after this year?
I guess I could jump in first. I would say from the perspective of my paper, the conversation perhaps is a slightly different since it's a commercial setting. Of course, my topic was on a traditionally white male European artist. And although I think a lot of his work brought up an interesting conversation of the privilege that he holds in these settings, it also at the same time elevated himself as an artist of that identity. But having said that, at the same time, I've also been really fortunate to work within curatorial settings in the non-for-profit sector. And that's why I love a topic like Sasha's so much, because it is such a relevant and important conversation. You know, how are we going to go about really changing the demographics of especially North American institutions? And I think that's a conversation that's beginning to be had. I think maybe in some cases at the executive level, there might be some hesitation. And I know people I've talked to have even counted deaccessioning as like the D word. It's the bad word that should be unspoken in some cases. But I think that work is definitely in progress. And I'm really excited that that work is to be done. And there's obviously a lot of work to continue doing. We still have a long way to go, but I do think it's on its way in some ways, which is exciting.
I mean, I think that the reality that museums are turning to deaccessioning as a way to fund these diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is indicative of, I don't know, I guess the backwardness of a lot of these big institutions, because like selling work should not be the resort, you know, but there's no other, you know, initiative, and there's no desire by major donors to necessarily fund those initiatives in the way that they need to be funded to enact real change. And deaccessioning is the I guess the newest resort.
Yeah, going off of that, I think the best thing that's coming from this, one of the best things, is how educated people are, the populace, the museum consumers are becoming. And I think there are kind of two parts to looking at that, applying to what Megan and Sasha were talking about, and then also to my archive as well. I think that one, like within museums, I think the educated populace is really able to come in and challenge those spaces, especially asking those questions that Sasha brought up about like, where is the money coming from? Who was on the board? Who was at the top leadership? Is this just performative, you know, work that we're doing by deaccessioning the easiest ones to get rid of? But what is actually, you know, what's in the archives? Where is everything from? You know, is it colonial? Is it stolen objects? I think these are questions that we're all learning to start asking about those big museums. And I think the second side to that as well is kind of what my archive is working in, is more of that radically remade space, as Candace Chu would say, right? Actually creating new spaces that are completely organically grown up just for people of color, for minoritized populations historically. I think those spaces are also, if not more, meaningful because they're actually from the roots intended for being radical and remade in that sense. And so I think both are very important, and both are just rely on the public and all of us having these conversations for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a question in the chat from Caleb. Does deaccessioning also include the rotation of galleries or works through the spaces in museum halls, responding to the often liminal physical space non-white, non-men artists take up in museums?
I think that the acquisitioning of new works often results with that kind of an exchange. I mean, if you know, buying remarkable works by women artists and artists of color, they're able to exchange some of those works that were, you know, once, so some of that space that was once taken up by white male artists with that new work. But deaccessioning on its own just refers to the sale of art from a museum collection to fund the acquisition of new work or to fund the care of the museum's collection.
If I may, I actually wanted to jump in and ask Eliza a question. I've had some experience working on visual archives specifically focused on Afro-Latinx subjects in both North America and South America. And I was wondering if you think this challenge of welcoming these voices into these space could also in some way be tied to the lack of identity that a lot of these subjects are given. I know in the archives I've looked in, sometimes you'll have these figures that like these beautiful images of people of color in these spaces, but then there's no documentation surrounding their identity, when you'll see the same images of, say, white settlers, and you can have their entire history laid out for you in the archives. So I was wondering if you faced that challenge in your work and how you could speak to that.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, we should definitely talk later. I think that's incredibly thoughtful. I think that's a really, really good question. And I mean, that's part of the challenge. That's why the archive, when I started it, it was actually very, very specific. It was focused on people who served in the Navy from 1960 onwards, and were in that wave of immigration, and then immigrated specifically to Southern California. And so I have multiple ties to that, both through my family, through the community that I'm in. And so a lot of the advantage was coming at it from that point and being able to actually have these conversations and collect oral histories as well, alongside the photographs and everything. And so it's very much a community-based initiative. But I think you're absolutely right. Part of the amnesia, the public amnesia, is just from the lack of documentation, because so often the documentation comes from, like you said, from the colonizers themselves, and that's just reproduces the colonial gaze right over and over. And so it's images like this that are from the community, within the community, and presenting to the public, I think, that kind of combat that. But I think that's absolutely something that people need to be focusing on more. And even if we are, you know, only relying on resources from the colonial perspective, then there's still ways that we can be providing context, resources, you know, perspectives from people who are in that minoritized population to actually combat that and create more of a nuanced narrative. But we should definitely talk later as well about that. That's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, just to jump off of that, I guess it also kind of shows how in order to carve out these spaces, we really do need to turn towards more like oral histories rather than government records in order to tell these stories. And so, yeah, I think Eliza, your presentation particularly really spoke to that. If there's no more questions, should we move on to the next panel, or Anna?
I think we can take a break until about 1 when we're set to have 1919 speak. So yeah, take a little breather. Thank you for all the speakers in our first panel. They were truly excellent. Yeah, thank you. So welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started with our special guest presentation from 1919. 1919 is an independent arts and cultural production platform designed for Canada's Black and racialized communities. Founded in 2017, 1919 organize and produce transformative works across their platform through a lens that is radical, honest, and grounded in the rejection of oppressive institutions. 1919 magazine is an independent, critical, and editorial publication actively providing space for young Black and racialized people to see themselves and their experiences reflected. The direction of each print issue, civic project, and community event that they organize is informed by a unique conceptual understanding that is reinforced and made up of historical precedents, legacies of international struggle, reimagining, and dreaming. 1919 grounds itself in anti-capitalist and anti-racist systems of thought, which lie at the foundation of their revolving and multidisciplinary publication. Today, they're here to talk to us about their platform, the Black Printing Press, and grassroots art and movement building. Please welcome Shanat and Caleb from 1919.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna, for that lovely introduction. And thank you again to HASA for having us, giving us this space to speak about 1919, our growing platform, and the work that we do. A little about me, my name is Shanhat. I'm currently in my 5th and graduating year of undergraduate study at U of T. I'm completing a double major in history and political science with a minor in African studies. My academic interests are particularly centered around decolonial, revolutionary, and intellectual histories, specifically the 20th century production of work that is part of this larger entity of what we know to be the Black radical tradition. And I've always been incredibly passionate about history, and enrolling at U of T, I was looking forward to learning the histories of people who are generally excluded from the curriculums of post-secondary education and the pathways that this learning would open for me, not only academically, but in my personal life. And it is through this learning that I met wonderful people that were organizing in the U of T community. And then I heard about the work that my friend Caleb was pursuing with 1919. And personally, joining 1919 has allowed me to integrate my formal academic learning with community engagement in ways that activate alternative and informal forms of knowledge production and also its redistribution. And yeah, I hope you guys all enjoy our presentation today and get to know a little bit about our work, and I'll hand it over to Caleb.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Shanha, for the introduction. Thanks, Anna and HASA U of T for hosting the symposium and inviting us as well. My name is Kayla Johannes. I hold a undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto with a specialist in architectural studies and a minor in African studies. I'm the founder of 1919 magazine, and my personal and academic interests center the experiences and knowledge of Black communities, and that's what empowers me to pursue this action-oriented community work that I'm passionate about, and really serves as the basis for a lot of what we do at 1919. So this is going to be the summary of our short presentation today. It's going to be pretty straightforward. I think we'll do questions afterwards, but like feel free to put anything in the chat box, anything that comes to your mind. Yeah, so we'll be talking about 1919 and what it is. We'll be talking about our work, which is titled Abolitionist Futures, because that is ultimately what we strive for and care about. And then shortly at the end, we'll be talking a bit about the Black press, grassroots art, movement building, and how that kind of how that references the work we do with the art world as well as our space within it. 1919 magazine, as Anna mentioned a little bit, is a critical and editorial publication. We organize and produce works that transform spatial, physical, and digital boundaries that rejects oppressive institutions. I founded 1919 in 2017, and it was really in response to 3 different sources of frustrations I was feeling. The first one being that 1919 responds to racist and elitist media organizations and art institutions in Canada that don't value the stories or contributions of Black or Indigenous peoples. This point ties really well to the 2 previous presentations that we heard earlier about the public archive as well as deaccessioning. So 1919, one of the sources of frustration is really that the colonial gaze as well as the coloniality of museums and art institutions, as well as media organizations as an extension. Secondly, 1919 responds to the inequalities of access Black, Indigenous, and racialized groups face in their neighborhoods in regards to equal learning opportunities, as well as access to other arts-based opportunities and programs that simply do not exist. And lastly, 1919 responds to the overwhelmingly Eurocentric and anti-Black educational institutions at the primary, secondary, and post-secondary level that institutionalize and monopolize knowledge production through a Eurocentric lens and canon. We challenge this idea directly in our magazine by archiving and focusing on the knowledge production of Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. The reason why we're focused on addressing these needs of these communities is because we recognize that these groups continue to feel effects of violent global colonialism and now remain subjugated under the pretense of a multicultural state where whiteness is still the key to opportunity and power, and this fact is reinforced daily by traditional media. And just that's a little bit about kind of what we do, and kind of what started 1919. These kind of very key sources of frustrations within these different institutions, within the community, as well as, yeah.
Great. So now that you know a little bit about the origins of 1919, I'm going to speak a little bit more to the specifics of which our ideas are kind of in our work is grounded on. So 1919 essentially grounds itself in an anti-capitalist and anti-racist system of thought. This is what lies at the heart of our foundation, both the publication and community engagement. Driven by our mission and vision, we are committed to operating on the foundational frameworks and values of Indigenous solidarity, strengthening and reimagining community, knowledge building and knowledge sharing, advocating for the release of all political prisoners and the abolition of prisons, intersectional womanism, and global liberation for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. While our platform is constantly expanding and taking on new projects, 1919 is committed to actively responding to the needs and suggestions of our community by being flexible in our programming, accessible in our delivery, and offering a space for members of our community to contribute to our work how they see fit. Our vision essentially is to continue building and designing a platform for the production of art and multidisciplinary projects en route to our liberation. And you can see in the following slide, these are the ways that we do this, specifically through our 1919 print magazine and digital publication, 1919 Radio, and our community outreach and civic engagement projects, which we try to do alongside these published works. So our print and digital publication brings together the voices of Black and racialized community actors to share their art, stories, and critique and conversation with each other, the reader, and their fellow community members. All of our contributors in our print publication are paid. We accept pieces for our online publication on a rolling basis, but these submissions are currently only voluntary. So in 2019, 1919 released its fourth issue, Reimagining Community. And this issue explored the themes and topics of hyperpolicing and the criminalization of Black communities, transnational solidarities, communal care and healing, chronic illness and disability, incarceration, creative writing as revolutionary praxis, and anti-Black racism within the Canadian school systems. And we also recently published our fifth issue, Free Dreams, at the end of February. Our greatest inspiration for this issue was to connect the animated dreams of our ancestors to the specific energy and upheaval mounted by dreamers today. We asked, how do we use our dreams and the art that they birth to take us to a new future? Free Dreams represents our commitment to dream outside the confines of colonial architecture that defines our lives in relationship to the state. All of the issues we published and the work we are passionate about at 1919 are a reflection of the values and beliefs that ground us in the work that we wish to do, the communities we represent, and the freedoms we seek. So included in this latest issue, you'll find topics related to abolition, reclaiming the future, displacement and colonialism, revolt, heartache, teaching as a foundational element of dreaming, and Black futurism. And you'll find these stories communicated in written and visual mediums such as poetry, essays, creative writing, photography, visual art, and theater. You can find accessible PDF versions of both issues at 1919meg.com, or you can also purchase a print edition of Free Dreams, and it's also priced at like a pay what you can. The price of the magazine starts at $10, and any additional donation goes directly to paying our feature contributors. And sorry, yeah, and most importantly, we have our digital publication, which I mentioned, and also a new series, which we have titled The Black Cultural Archives. Here you can find a wide range of pieces published to our website, and they are critical pieces, reading lists, poetry, artist profiles, and more recently, you can find an essay published by Aisha Yusuf, and she is a 23-year-old Somali Canadian author who just published her debut young adult fiction novel titled A Race to the Finish Line. And her essay is titled The Publishing Industry Erases Black Voices, where she kind of narrates her journey and the difficulties of publishing her novel as a Black Muslim woman. And like I mentioned, we also have our new series titled The Black Cultural Archives, which seeks to consolidate and honor Black cultural workers around Canada who commit their art and creativity and labor to honoring Black historicism and its subsequent impact on social and cultural tradition.
Thanks, Shahat. That was wonderful. So following our magazine, our digital publication, our next kind of stream of organizing is our radio platform. 1919 Radio is a community-based platform for independent DJs and artists, and is also the audio home of 1919's political education series, which features interviews, conversations, and panel talks. Originally, 1919 Radio was created to challenge anti-Black club spaces in Toronto that police Black cultural production art forms such as rap and hip-hop. For DJs, this meant being told what music they can play and cannot play, and when they should play it. For Black people, this meant a growing list of unsafe communal spaces in Toronto where our presence and art are mined for material and aesthetics while we remain tokenized, surveilled, and policed by owners, staff, and the establishment. So this was established in 2018 for these very reasons. After a long hiatus, we wanted to bring 1919 Radio back and build on this platform by introducing interviews and conversations to our regular independent DJ programming. Our first conversation on 1919 Radio was hosted by one of our members, Mohammed Nur, who spoke to Dr. Jared Ball, scholar and author of I Mix What I Like, a mixtape manifesto, as well as The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. Two really great books, as well as a great conversation you guys should check out. but they speak about his books, mixtape radio, emancipatory journalism, and the gentrification of Black music and media. This episode includes an abundance of brilliance, but also grounds our projects as fundamentally rooted in anti-colonial resistance, emancipatory journalism, and cooperative community power. We also hope our evolving vision for 1919 Radio will go alongside some of our corresponding projects that we are working on to build a decentralized learning space for our communities. We've currently been working on, probably coming up to almost a year, on drafting a project called the Community Syllabus. This is essentially going to function as a centralized digital resource hub for the informal learning of abolitionist thought. Our community has expressed to us their desire to reimagine their roles in their community and how they can be more intentional, engaged, and meaningful in their community and advocacy work. The Community Syllabus lives in the space between text and world, where Indigenous and Black communities, forgotten and gotten by colonial, capital, and racial forces, direct their learning, their futures, and what teaching each other should look like. The syllabus will contain critical materials such as historical primary source documents, scholarly literature, films, video clips, teach-ins, and panels. The materials of the community syllabus will live within this hub and animate the traditional syllabus for use in academia in ways that are local, action-oriented, and practice-informed. We're also very engaged, and I think what makes us unique as a magazine, as well as like arts organization and community group, is we're very engaged in the community, as well as fulfilling our role as active civic members of our city in a radical as well as decolonial and anti-racist way. So I'll just briefly mention some of our past civic projects that we worked on and touch on some of them, as well as one we're going to start soon. So in 2018, we hosted a clothing drive in partnership with the Christie Refugee Welcome Center for refugee claimants and asylum seekers in the Toronto area. We also have hosted an art installation called Who Are You Doing This For? That examined the role of the artists as well as the audience in their consumption of racialized labor and how that dynamic works. In 2019, we held a book drive for federal prison libraries across Canada. In that, we recognized the kind of woeful access inmates and incarcerated folks behind prison walls across Canada had to access to knowledge and books and their library resources. So we collected over 6,000 books in partnership with Climate Justice Toronto, the Caribbean Student Association at University of Toronto, the Black Students Association at York University, the Caribbean Solidarity Network, as well as some local counselors, like just really kind of spreading the word and amplifying this action. And we were able to send 6,000 books, which was a really great initiative. We also hosted an event called Black Earth in partnership with a local urban farm. Cheyenne Sundance, who owns Sundance Harvest, hosted this event, and it was really just about food sovereignty, food justice, and kind of what food apartheid and food deserts look like in Canada, and how Black and Indigenous communities can start producing as well as organizing their own right for food, because food insecurity is a policy decision, and we could begin to push back if we have this kind of knowledge. So we hosted that event. And then currently upcoming, we are working with an organization called the Prisoners Correspondence Project, which is a pen pal project for LGBTQ prisoners in Canada and the United States, which connects them with people on the outside to write letters to form relationships. And we're going to be doing some outreach for them in like a small program over the course of the next few weeks. So we're really excited for that. And hopefully, yeah, you guys can check that out as well. We'll probably link the Prisoner Correspondence Project, the Prisoners Correspondence Project link below, or a link after our presentation. So if you guys are interested in learning more about them, you guys could definitely do that. And so within all of these civic and community projects, we recognize that we can't do this alone. And not only that we can't do this alone, but like we are truly building a collective that is empowered by different communities across this land. So from Toronto to where I'm currently in Calgary to Edmonton, we have a capacity to connect and embrace Black and racialized peoples because of our decentralized and decolonial grounding. All of the work in Free Dreams, all the projects we undertake in 1919 couldn't be accomplished without the efforts of this entire village. The labor and love involved in producing, organizing, and distributing and creating work in our issues as well as in our civic actions, like I said, have homes across our chapter cities, Toronto and Calgary, as well as Edmonton. Free Dreams, Dream Sounds, a Black Culture Archive, our book drive for federal prison libraries all represent our attempts to foster radical community spaces and cultural understandings that acknowledge our politicized realities exist across architectures, geographies, neighborhoods, cities, borders, and our struggle for freedom remains the same.
Great. So as an independent cultural production platform, we're able to continue this work through mostly the donations of our community and our application of grants. And so aligned and informed by our values of knowledge sharing, community building, we're committed to remaining an independent and autonomous organization, completely unaffiliated with any corporate entities or large for-profit organization. Donations to 1919 go towards paying our contributors, digital writers, print writers, photographers, artists, and other cultural workers a fair amount. Also paying our musicians and DJs a fair amount for sets on our radio platform or even just community events. Covering obviously the printing costs of our magazine, and hopefully in the future creating a micro grant to support cultural workers in need of financial assistance. Besides supporting 1919 through financial means, we also encourage our audience to take part in long-term revolutionary action in the ways they best see fit, whether that's engaging with radicalizing literature through community book clubs or online reading lists, getting involved with local initiatives that practice this type of solidarity with incarcerated folks, or spreading the word about Black-led leftist publications like 1919. There are many ways in which we can all work to sort of cultivate this greater abolitionist community. And it's super important for Black and racialized youth to know that platforms like ours even exist, and that a space for their visual art, literature, poetry, creative writing, and cultural work exists, and we are committed to making their voices heard. At the moment, 1919 is a steadily growing platform. Our team is relatively small, and as our capacities grow, we intend to bring on more support from volunteers and community members who are interested in helping us in our work. And if this is something that might interest you, feel free to shoot us an email or get in touch over Instagram, and we can see what works for you and how you want to contribute, how you want to help, or even add you to a list of volunteers when the time comes that we do need specific help for events or things like that.
And I'll just jump in quickly and say that all the photos that you guys have seen in this presentation, as well as these two on here, the one on the right of the boxes is a picture of one shipment we sent out to federal prison libraries. And then the one on the left is a vision board we had at the Reimagining Community Release Party. This would have been in December 2019. And you kind of see the calls to action as well as the thoughts, the dreaming, the dream shared. So this is kind of the essence of our work. The people that support us is the essence of what we do and really power us, and why it's important for us, even in this presentation, for you to see the faces that contribute, as well as the kind of struggle and joy that is birthed, when working towards our future. But yeah.
So we kind of wanted to bring in this connection with the theme of the event that HASA is putting on, which is this idea of reconnecting, and how does art create connections when there is an absence of them, which really speaks to what's at the heart of 1919, which is this need to partake and encourage liberatory ways of thinking, specifically through dreaming and reimagination. So we have a realistic understanding that currently we are not free. Freedom requires a collective rejection of the present and the constant effort to reimagine a better future for us all. So 1919 aims to connect the revolutionary spirit of our past combined with the momentum of our present and practice the radical act of creating a better future. And art is that vehicle. And I'll just make quick reference to the two images on the screen that you're seeing right now. On the left side, you can see that photo was taken in 1962, holding up the newspaper Unarmed Negroes killed in cold blood by Los Angeles police. And on the right side is actually an image featured in our Free Dreams latest issue from a photographer by the name of David Ajibadu. And it's from the June 2020 Toronto protest for George Floyd and Regis Korchinski-Paquette. So those images are kind of a side-by-side demonstration of how we try to be historically and internationally informed and kind of bring that into our current moment and current politicized moment, that energy, and use those to dream of a better future. So in our print publications and our civic community work, we pose the question to our community to encourage this type of thinking and cultural production. What does reimagining community mean to you? Can you dream freely? Can we? Why not? How can we use our dreams and the art that they birth to take us to a new future? These are important questions we ask to ourselves and others in the effort to create connections not only to one another, but towards a new future. 1919 aims to encourage and give voice to futuristic freedom thinking despite the absence of freedom itself. And art is the means by which we can catalyze our community spirit and stimulate political education and build community action and power. Art and cultural production utilized as a method of knowledge sharing has historical roots as an effective and also as a rapid way of spreading information and mobilizing people. So we see this throughout Black history. The printed and disseminated word has given voice to the revolutionary dreams of those before us, and that is the radical legacy in which we wish to carry on.
And through that radical legacy, we understand the importance and the significance of the press. We understand the evolution of the printing press as being a fundamental tool both for society and significantly the state in their attempts to manufacture consent in the production of news and media. Pamphlets, flyers, and newsletters have been critical elements aiding Black freedom struggles internationally because of their ability to mass communicate messages, ask questions, and critique in public space. Black freedom movements have utilized art as well as the printing press as principal instruments in their struggle, and 1919 is no different. Our publication is grounded upon this history as well as the Black radical tradition and thinks through what a print publication means for grassroots voices within African diasporic communities. So fundamentally, and going back to why 1919 started, there's always been a disconnection, an agenda of erasure sanctioned by the state aiming to limit and restrict African diaspora communities speaking and grounding with each other in public, in private, and in text. When we speak of groundings, we call back upon the work of Walter Rodney, who championed the term in his book, The Groundings with My Brothers, as more than just a method of teaching, learning, or knowledge production. Groundings meant breaking out of academic isolation and engaging in the mutual exchange of knowledge with those struggling on the ground. We use Rodney's lessons on groundings as critical pedagogy to connect our community to the collective challenge of rejecting oppressive and exploitative systems of power. The Black grassroots press has always been associated with connecting art with resistance. We carry this tradition forward in our print and digital publication and in our radio. Thank you. There's some information about our website as well as some of our channels on social media, information about submissions or where you can hit us up, and ways you can sign up for our newsletter. We really appreciate the time. Also appreciate the previous presentations, and hopefully some of the things we mentioned kind of also connect to the problems mentioned earlier about the institution and the public archive, and hopefully you kind of see where 1919 works and why we're here. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I also, sorry, just quickly in response to Calibre, I put the link in the chat for the Prisoner Correspondence Project, and it's a very timely project, we think, especially right now, the amount of prisoners that are facing extreme isolation and terrible conditions. I think it's a really good initiative that people, if you're interested to take part in, or even just to learn more about the work that's going on, that's totally fine too, but I would definitely look into it. And yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful and rich presentation, and I hope that we'll now open things up to questions.
Yes, yeah. Any questions, comments, discussions as well with the any of like the previous speakers, we'd love to, talk about the connections between, the critiques of the public archive and the institution, as well as like our kind of decolonial practices.
Wow, can I just come in and just jump in and say that that was a great presentation, and also it does very much tie into some of the conversations that were happening in the previous panel. I just kind of want to bring attention to you guys' website because it's incredible. I had no idea this was something that was going on, and then when Anna mentioned Anna, I was looking on your website, I was like, wow, this is beautifully. I love your design too, and yeah, and I guess I have a question kind of related to more of the times that we're in right now, and how in lockdown it is really hard to kind of do all of these events in person and kind of do all of this community outreach. And I think the stuff that you guys are doing right now is incredible, but I'm just wondering how are you guys doing in lockdown? And of course it's affected so many people, right, and in different ways, but yeah, and just how can we kind of get involved during a time of complete isolation, I guess.
Do you want to jump in, Caleb, or should I?
You could take this.
Okay. Yeah, it has been quite a challenge, especially trying to organize a community and collect this collective spirit online. We've had a couple of events that have been on this digital space. We had just a concert. It was called Dream Sounds Concert in August, where we basically had a bunch of Toronto, Calgary artists, local artists, basically come and perform, and it was just a bunch of people in the audience, just hyping them up. We had a DJ set, and that was kind of our first introduction into okay, how do we do some type of uplifting spirit event in the summertime that still kind of brings people together, that's enjoyable. And so that went really well. People really seem to enjoy it, and obviously we pay all of our artists and things like that. Like Khaled mentioned in the previous issue release, issue 4, Reimagining Community, there was a very beautiful big public event for the release of the issue. This time, unfortunately, we aren't able to do that, but we did organize a digital event over Zoom, where we basically just had the contributors come, speak about their piece, talk about the editorial process and stuff, trying to connect it to what's going on in the world right now. And then we play a really fun game of Family Feud. So we try to always integrate some type of enjoyment and spirit and this collectivism. And it's also the people that show up is Khaled mentioned, it's really a village that makes up this space, because the fact that we're still able to come and meet on Zoom and do all these events still is really just a testament to how dedicated our community is to building radical community spaces. And that's not any type of obstacle for us. And it is difficult. And sometimes it is to our advantage, because we are centered in Calgary, a little bit in Edmonton, and also in Toronto, and we do stem a lot from U of T networks and stuff like that. So the digital space is also really great as well, because we are able to span across this land and still be able to create community networks. And yeah, so I think it's a really foundational part of our organizing, that we're able to do all of this at once. And it's really what we have to do. It's not really an option. We have to find ways around obstacles, and there are other obstacles, not even through the pandemic, but state obstacles, colonial obstacles. So this really just a testament to how radical our community is and what we're trying to build.
Wow, well said. Yeah, I would completely agree. I mean, even on our end too, just trying to host events and events like this too, having it to be all online. I can totally sympathize with that. Yeah. Are there any other questions in the chat or among
I
us?
actually have sort of a two-parter. So I think your website and your presentation today emphasize a lot about youth, the importance of youth. And I guess I'd like to know both why you decided to initiate this at this point in your lives, as fairly young people, and also what why the emphasis on youth in these kind of radical, like anti-capitalist, anti-racist initiatives? What is the importance, do you feel?
That's a good question. I think in terms of kind of why, I think in terms of like why we kind of initiated this work, as well as like a lot of us doing this work at U of T, like in university, juggling a lot of commitments and as well as like extracurriculars. I think it's just um, the importance of like kind of what we mentioned at the end, where Walter Rodney talks about engaging in mutual exchange in the community. I think that's something um, you kind of need to do, especially I think for myself being in U of T and in faculties where I wasn't exposed to knowledges outside of a European or Eurocentric canon in architecture, which is extremely white and it doesn't really get into the subaltern or the grassroots. I think engaging like that community exchange fulfills a kind of spiritual need for that information. So I think that kind of references like I think for a lot of us this work is like kind of like fulfilling spiritually where we don't really get that kind of like I said, we're frustrated in some sense, whether it's in that university or with the museums and the public archives, or just in the community with the like the physical, the practice, the social, the political, and economic challenges like Indigenous and Black communities in like racialized cities across Canada like really have to contend with, as well as in reserves where there's still a lack of clean drinking water. So I think there's real just like material realities that kind of fulfills this work as well as a need for it. And then regarding the youth, I think it's important to engage and learn with them outside of schools. I think we kind of see also the limits of not only the education we get like kindergarten through high school, but as well as in the university. So I think being able to expose people to different forms of education as well as some that's decentralized, accessible, affordable. There's lots of limits around education. I think, like especially like education and connection, which I think could be really important. And our community really expresses that to us. They kind of say that I have friends who like, yo, like I don't really get to learn these things, or a lot of what 1919 does as well is like we want to speak to like the working class community. We want to speak to the people who aren't at University of Toronto, like ourselves, who don't get exposed in some sense to maybe a radical space or a radical professor or a radical program in whatever capacity that is. Take that with a grain of salt, but people who don't have the funds or the means to go to these institutions who are increasingly marginalized. So those youth especially we really want to engage with because they have the potential and they deserve to have this knowledge.
Yeah, and also like just to add on to that a little bit, I'll try not to ramble, but I just know personally, like me and even in Caleb being in class together and like learning about certain things, and it's like people don't know this. Like people aren't really exposed to this type of knowledge, and like why did it take me until third year of university to learn about colonial architectures, about coloniality, about popular leaders that aren't Martin Luther King, you know what I mean? And like that I also think is a responsibility of us. Walter Rodney also talks about the responsibility of the Black educated class to go out and educate the youth. And he himself was the youth, like Frederick Hampton was assassinated at 21 for being the leader of a huge political movement in the United States. So I think this is a very timely age in which people need to be radicalized. And I think that, like I said, it is our responsibility as educated people. And that's one of my biggest goals or like things I'm trying to get out of 1919, because it's not really rigid, our space. It's really a space for anybody who can come in and kind of carve out what they want to do within our platform. And they approach us in that nature. And for me, my intention is basically just to take the extremely enriching education from university and kind of redistribute that in ways that make sense and aren't necessarily elitist. I know there's a big misunderstanding that like Black radical texts are elitist and inaccessible and the language is difficult, but they were written at a time where it was for the working class, it was for the Black masses, it was for the people. So what I'm trying to do and what we're trying to do, I guess, in a sense, is continue on that legacy and continue in that tradition. Some of the greatest Black thinkers, intellectuals, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, all these people were educated in elitist institutions. And it's through that they kind of mastered the methodology, mastered the language, and then went out and did what they did. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's why the youth, in my opinion, it's a very critical time. And like Caleb said, we're kind of, there's a sense of betrayal that we feel from the education system, in the sense that we aren't getting the knowledge that we need that's essential for our liberation. So that's what our platform is trying to do, and kind of decentralize and redistribute information and knowledge. So yeah.
Thank you. That was really well said.
Yeah, your work has been really fantastic, and hearing about, you know, your work through your presentation, it's just looking at your website, it's amazing. And it just brought up a lot of questions for me, and thoughts about how there's something so interesting about the exclusivity and privileging of the, you know, the very education about colonial history, right? And I see this in my own work. I'm an Indigenous person, so a lot of my work has been centered on residential school archives and looking into, you know, my reserves history with the colonial government and all these kind of things, and how it was so hard for me to get really into these residential school archives until recently, right? And just writing all this stuff is so, it can be a lot and really hard, but you know, without really rehashing a lot of trauma, because I don't really want to do that for you guys. But I guess my question is, how is it working in these systems that are so fundamentally anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, and what does it look like for like navigating these systems for 1919, and what does that look like in your work specifically?
That's a really good question. I think you bring up really good points as well that connects, like, of course, like the symposium's like overarching theme of connecting. I think um, we we don't see the connection with colonial institutions to our communities. We see the rupture, we see the violence, we see the erasure, we see the marginalization. So that doesn't exist for us. I think for the examples you mentioned, as well as like again refer back to the presentations earlier, like the public archive, the public museum, the like public institutions don't serve indigenous communities on this land. They don't serve displaced Black communities in Africa, the diaspora communities. So for us, it's really about a departure. I think for us, it's really about saying no, we don't need to be diversity and quota inclusion, and it's really about revolutionary thinking and education, and connecting with our community directly. I think we don't see the connection to the state because the violence, the erasure, and the colonialism is ongoing, and it only exacerbates, and nothing really changes in regards to our material realities and kind of our libertarian futures.
Yeah, and kind of just to add on to that a little bit, in that revolutionary way of thinking, it's really important for us to realize and recognize that representation is an obstacle to liberation. We're not looking for our representation from CBC. We're not looking for our accurate or adequate representation from the Globe and Mail. You know, it is our responsibility to provide those platforms and to encourage the voice of Black and racialized people to not have to fight their ways into communities that don't recognize them, but to realize that those communities exist alongside them, and it's not something that they have to fight towards, but just have to look around and find. And we want to be that platform that allows people to do that. And that's why I said it's really important not only for people to know that we do this, but that we just exist, and that platforms like this exist, and that they're growing, and there's a lot more coming. And you know, yeah. So that's basically it.
Good question. That was a really good question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer.
And I just want to say thank you to all the love for the website. I didn't know it was that great, but we are a small team of people. And so it really means a lot when you guys appreciate the visual aspects, even though none of us have any artistic background whatsoever.
No, it's beautiful. It's stunning. I almost wanted there to be like a digital edition of your magazine, because I think it was well done. Also, for those interested, like I wasn't able to include your SoundCloud link in the brochure, but like for anyone interested, like definitely go check out the website, because oh yes, thank you, Iago, for linking it, because it really does enhance, you know, the work that you guys are doing.
And so yeah, and I encourage you guys, sorry to cut you off, to there, like I mentioned, there are the PDF accessible versions, like our commitment to knowledge and accessibility. Both of our issues are available online on the PDF. And if you're interested in just scrolling through or reading maybe some of the pieces, you could maybe learn something, connect to something, you know, and yeah.
I do have like another question, sort of following up on some of the ideas we've already been talking about, but maybe if you want to discuss if you feel that like social media is an effective tool in sort of these revolutionary both organizing and disseminating information, or if you feel, you know, is there trouble in because, you know, social media is run by these like major capitalistic institutions, do you feel that that is that there's trouble in that mediation, or yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think this is I just want to like our interview or conversation with Jared Ball. He's a media studies scholar, so he got really into it. So I'm just gonna also kind of just reference some of the things he mentioned. And one of the things he mentioned is that basically everything we do online is a manicured experience, right? We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube, we're getting algorithmically like selected things for us. We're getting as well as like paid products, like it's a payola relationship between what you see and what organizations want you to see. Like organizations meaning big, like multinational corporations. So in that sense, I don't see like social media necessarily being a great tool like for long-term evolutionary action, especially in regards to the ways we're exposed to all sorts of like really crude images and like forms of violence on there, and it kind of really hasn't changed our perception on things. So I think personally, I think it might be causing more harm than good, personally.
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot, especially in our meetings, just in general about this Instagram, what's it called, advocacy industrial complex system. Like it's not sustainable, not for us. So there, that's part from, and me, that is part for like part of us trying to reimagine a future of where we don't exist within these limited and like very confined spaces where we can only do certain type of work on certain types of spaces. So yeah, that's a big thing. Like we don't want to be confined to that. There's only so much you can get out. There's only so many people that can be exposed to our magazine. That's why we say like word of mouth is really important.
Yeah.
Our networks are really important because it's not necessarily sustainable, and we don't want to be confined to that. And like I said, we have to reimagine different pathways and different alternatives in this like quickly changing media digital space. So yeah.
And I also add that like even on Instagram, there's like there's so many like indigenous rights organizations as well as like radical organizations that are shadow banned, that you won't see their stories, you won't see their posts. Like they regularly have to ask people like, oh, comment on this if you see this, like we're getting shadow banned. So there's also all types of ways with like also Facebook's rule on political posts that like I know Miriam Kaba recently released her book, and like she couldn't post it because it was like a political book and it was just about abolition. So yeah, there's so many like laws and regulations as well as bureaucracy that like defines our relationship to these social media channels that definitely serve capitalism and do not serve our liberation.
Yeah, thank you. I just wonder because for me, I think I found a lot of like as you said, like a lot of this information isn't available in school. Like university is one thing, but even like growing up as a child, you know, you're not going to find this. And I found that I learned a lot of like more revolutionary kind of thought from social media, and I just think that's interesting that it's not even really reliable. Maybe it was never, maybe it could be, or maybe it would never be, but yeah, it's so tricky.
Yeah, and like I don't want to encourage the idea that like social media as a whole and the information put out there is unreliable and we shouldn't reference it. Like same with me, like I've learned incredible information, incredible resources, great histories, both in the institution and outside of it, and just from my peers in general, you know. So It is hard to encourage people to just look at things on social media with a critical lens. Not everybody's able to do that, especially if it's information not known to you. Like I've seen things like post these like advocacy like Canva type posts of like people creating terms that make absolutely no sense, and like they've legitimized it as an actual phenomena or social experience or something. Like I could go so into it, and it literally doesn't make sense. So and that is stemming from a problem that people don't know that this language already exists. This language of Black revolutionary thinking already exists. It's already been written for us. It's our job, our responsibility to kind of harness that into our current political movement, see how it fits into this day and age, and move forward. But there's no need for the creation of new terms like ally fatigue and colonized guilt. You know what I mean? Like these are really just like, this is a product of like erasure. It's a product of like very limited access to information that people don't know exists, or people don't know should be referenced. You know what I mean? So it is kind of give and take. It's really hard to encourage people to think critically about things that they may not be ever been exposed to on social media. So, you know, it's kind of that gray area, in my opinion, I think.
Actually, I think, well, thank you so much for answering like those questions. Your talk has been so rich and informative, and thank you so much for joining us. I hope everybody will check out 1919's website and look at both their newest edition of their journal and or of their magazine, and previous editions as well. I think we're ready to actually move on to our next panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mari. That was fantastic. My name is Laura, and I'm HASA's Public Relations and Social Media Coordinator this year. And our next speaker is Farid Djamalov. Farid is a rising senior studying art history at Yale University with an interest in queer theory, post-Soviet art, performance, and photography. He will be presenting his paper, Queer Gazes, Thomas Eakins' Taking the Count, 1898. Welcome, Farid.
Hi, thank you so much for your introduction, but also thank you for everyone for having this wonderful outlet for critical discourse at the undergraduate level. I think that this is a wonderful initiative, and also as a Native Canadian, this makes me happy. So yeah, my presentation today focuses on Eakins' Taking the Count. You could go on the next slide already. And so I'm focusing on its inherent homoeroticism and the implications of having such a homoerotic work in the 19th century America. And so the painting is depicted to the left, and I'm going to analyze both the painting and its sketch to give you a better understanding of the elements that prompted my interest in studying the homoerotic aspect. Before I go over all the methodologies I did. So this is an oil on canvas painting, which measures roughly 1 meter in width and height. And it is part of Eakins' 1898 series of paintings that treat the unusual subject of boxing. Bear in mind that in genteel Victorian America, representations of prize fighting were reserved almost exclusively to prints and the press, and definitely not to the quote unquote high art paintings, especially of the size. So even historically, the only precursor that comes to mind of an artwork depicting a pugilistic scene is the Hellenistic Greek bronze sculpture Boxer at Rest, which you could see to your right. And so Taking the Count depicts the conclusion of a historical 1898 boxing match in Philadelphia between Jack Daly and Charlie McKeever. And so you see the pallid Daly crouching and gazing defeatedly at his contender, and the diagonal composition created by the body of the fallen boxer accentuates the tense exchange of glances between both fighters, which is ultimately intercepted by the hand of the referee. So the referee is counting down the seconds marking Daly's defeat. Eakins' detailed inclusion of a large, exclusively male crowd heightens the spectacle gazes. The expected victor stands with his well-defined musculature, and rather than appearing like an unblemished and dignified Roman sculpture, as you can see to your right, which is ultimately also the only other reference to high art of an athlete in high art, McKeever evinces his humanity in his reddened face, shaggy body hair, and his socks sliding down to his boots. So classicized bodies are traditionally admired for beauty rather than sexuality, while these unidealized bodies in the painting are transgressively sexual. So this humanizing depiction of the two boxers can therefore be read as encouraging the viewer's objectification of their bodies. And the near nudity of the boxers appears circumstantially appropriate, thereby naturalizing the viewer's erotic gaze that is implied also to be masculine given the all-male setting. So on the next slide, you can see the preparatory sketch made for the painting, which is actually also the Yale University Art Gallery. And so Eakins depicts the two boxers fully naked here. And while Eakins attended boxing fights, he also had fighters pose nude for him in his studio. By asking models to remove their loincloth for the sketch, one wonders what the study of the genitalia and pelvis offered the painter, especially when the referee remains totally clad in his tuxedo. And so in the sketch, the defeated boxer assumes a different pose, which reveals more of his face, yet in both renditions, his eyes are fixated on the victor's phallus. By depicting the boxer in profile in the final painting, Eakins ambiguates the direction of Daly's gaze, heightening the homoerotic tension. Daly's gaze encourages the viewer's voyeurism, thereby threatening male viewers with the pleasure of gazing at the victor's body. By restricting the sketch and its final painting to dominantly fleshy colors, Eakins reimagines the scene as reflecting male psychological interiority, wherein the match represents an inner tension of homoerotic impulses. So in my paper, beyond using formal analysis, I'm comparing the sketch to its painting. I applied queer methodologies to surface the latent homoeroticism of the work, all while also completing a biographical reading of the artist to understand the context in which he was operating, and also what the significance of such a homoerotic portrayal might entail. So Eakins was from Philadelphia. He was born there and lived there most of his life. And he was a professor who transformed the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts to become a leading art institution. And his tenure, though, was controversial. He infamously removed a loincloth from his male model to demonstrate the model's pelvis to his female students. This controversy was also compounded by claims that Eakins had an affair with male students. And so when the artist was fired from the academy, some of his students actually joined him to form an arts league separate from the one that they were a part of, where they were able to follow a more experimental curriculum that explored male nudity more unabashedly. And so he went on to photograph and sketch naked men, but he always avoided depicting phalluses on large canvases, even in his most provocative painting, The Swimming Hole, which you could see in the next slide. While the New York court ruled in 1884 that mere nudity in male painting or sculpture is not obscenity, organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union continued to pressure art institutions to not display any artwork bearing any nudity. And this might have impacted Eakins' willingness to display nudity in his own works. So on the next slide, why is this painting ultimately important? So similar to Edward Monet's appropriation of the graceful odalisque pose when depicting his demi-monde subject Olympia, Eakins subversively appropriates the neoclassical male nude in his study of the mundane boxer. Taking the count is revolutionary in the way that it elevates low culture themes like boxing into the realm of fine arts. Like Manet, Eakins transgresses traditions of history painting and presents boxers stripped of mythologies and idealizations that complicate the constructed binaries of nudity and nakedness, sensuality and pornography. And so operating in a realist tradition, Eakins claims that a picture leaving too much to the imagination is cowardly. The queer facet to Eakins' version of realism, however, makes our understanding of the movement more dimensional, as it puts his work in dialogue with the development of queer history. In his book, The History of Sexuality, Michel Foucault points out that the concept of homosexuality as an identity, rather than a discrete act, sin, or crime, emerged only in the 19th century. The scandalous trials of Oscar Wilde's gross indecency with men in 1895, which must have resonated with Eakins, who was also indicted for his homosexuality earlier in his career, demonstrate how the mediatization of gayness broke the silence around the topic. Although the boxers might not be queer themselves, this painting taps into homoerotic energy that legitimizes a homoerotic gaze, and it contributes to the larger social conversation as a result through its play of gazes. The painting becomes an outlet for repressed sexual desires of the viewer. While there are numerous homoerotic paintings and sculptures in history, the non-idealized depiction of its subject matter and contemporaneous developments in society's conception of homosexuality as an identity make the latent homoeroticism of the painting more impactful to the viewer. So questions that I have for the future are that I'd like to delve more into the problem of gender in Eakin's paintings more, and also explore more the ethical component to him as an artist in person, which has been increasingly important since the Me Too movement. Eakin's Taking the Count does not go unproblematized, and as art historian Randall Griffin points out, this representation of exclusively sportsmen in a male-dominated space could be read as misogynistic nostalgia for an exclusively male culture. So this painting's potential attempt to destabilize the threat of women brings into discussion first wave feminism, thereby moving discussion around the work beyond idolatry of a tokenized queer artwork. Furthermore, Eakin's sexual relationship with his male students, along with allegations of sexual assault, incestuous advances, bestiality, and exhibitionism brought against him, feed into discussions of whether or not these aspects should factor into our consideration of the artist's work and how. As a result, Eakin's Taking the Count not only enriches discussions of realism as it relates to queer history, but also is a fertile ground for reflections on first wave feminism and ethical debates.
Thank you so much, Farid. So now we're going to be taking questions for the last two presentations. If you have any questions that you just want to put in the chat, someone from HASA can read them out loud as well.
I have a question that maybe we can start off with. Perhaps I think both of you talked about sort of the intentional representation of a sort of form of a body that perhaps fills in the gaps of the reality or what isn't acknowledged of the reality. So maybe you want to talk about what you think, or maybe expand more about that kind of intentionality of representing a body in the way that you want it to be represented. Yeah.
Yeah, in a similar way, I think I'm really interested in the psychological aspect as well. My broader research has to do with queer Russia in the 90s. And I think that what's really fascinating about the artists I study there, but also now with Eakin's in this case, is this idea of the viewer being actively a participant in the work. There's this really famous Kathy Opie photo where she has like Dyke written on the back of her neck, and it like confronts the viewer. And I think that Eakin's in a similar way is really like putting this bait for the viewer to explore a territory that they might feel more uncomfortable exploring in in the Victorian context, or even now, where you could be getting some sexual gratification or just pleasure, not gratification, just pleasure looking at it and like being in, like thinking in ways that you've been repressed your whole life to reflect. So yeah, I'm really interested in that very experiential kind of approach where the art evokes something psychological in the viewer.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you both.
He's presenting his paper today, The Lonesome Decadent, Art, Literature, and the Foundation of Fin de Siècle Archetype. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Everyone's been great. I'm very excited to be among all these great presenters. So I'll share my screen now. Okay. So in my contribution, I look at how loneliness contoured a particular character that resonated and reappeared throughout late 19th century European culture. This study, I focused on Joris Karl Huysmans' highly influential 1884 novel, Archubert, and artworks by Odilon Redon and Gustave Moreau to examine the collaboration of art and literature in articulating fin de siècle loneliness, with occasional reference to other books by the physician Max Nordau and the decadent author and playwright Rachilde. Archubert centers on Des Essence, whom Huysman defines as the exemplar of the decadent movement through his aristocratic status, his sickness, his seclusion, and his avid collecting. The novel dedicates its chapters to cataloging des Esseintes' eccentric tastes in furnishings, perfumes, flora, literature, and most importantly for us today, visual art. These aesthetic inclinations repeatedly highlight his alienation from common society, with his isolation reified by his voluntary confinement to an estate outside of Paris. His favorite flowers, for example, are said to be princesses of the vegetable kingdom, living aloof and apart, having nothing whatever in common with the popular plants or the bourgeois blooms. Among his art collections are works by the 19th century artists Odilon Redon, Gustave Moreau, Rodolphe Dresden, and the 17th century Dutch artist Jan Bruycken. All of these artists' works are said to conform to des Esseintes' predilection for erudite fancies, complicated nightmares, and suave and sinister visions. In analyzing Redon and Moreau with reference to Huysman's writing, I examined how loneliness, solitude, and disconnection colored the decadent aesthetic across media to shape the identity of a decadent as a solitary eccentric. Before I get into that topic, I want to briefly talk about the research behind it. The project was conceived specifically for the symposium, but it was derived from work I did in late 2020 that drew heavily on primary text from the period, often novels. The Fond du siècle gives numerous examples I could have analyzed regarding the interplay of art and literature. Aubrey Beardsley, for example, who you see on the left here, provided illustrations for literature, such as this frontispiece for Arthur Machen's 1894 novel, The Great God Pan, which helped to secure the novel's identification as decadent. Fernand Knopf would have also provided a suitable corpus of works, with artworks such as After Josephine Péladan, Le Vie Suprême, proudly displaying literary references. In this case, it's to a novel called Le Vie Suprême by Josephine Péladan, who was a art author, occultist, and curator in the 19th century. I ultimately landed on Acherbeur, Redon, and Moreau because of their high degree of influence, but also because they offer insight into an isolation that feels relevant today. The symposium's theme and its format are, sort of a response to the unprecedented conditions within which we find ourselves that need no introduction, I think. And so there were times last semester when I was studying this stuff, where I was locked inside, tending to my houseplants and poring over this art and literature, that I felt a little bit too close to des Esseintes. So that's sort of the background to this sort of theme. So typically discussions of loneliness in this period are centered around symbolism rather than decadence, such as in reference to this painting by Knopf, whose title, I Lock My Door Upon Myself, is a line from a poem by Cristina Rossetti. But these two movements, along with aestheticism, often bleed into one another. The assemblage of enigmatic imagery in this painting, for example, brings symbolists, like the woman who has kind of yellowed, unhealthy complexion and is surrounded by collected objects, including a sculpture and a painting, who is alone inside, and who is accompanied by wilting flowers, might very well read as a decadent. So there's an opportunity to explore this Fond du siècle theme from a different vantage point. One artwork in which loneliness is vividly envisioned is Redon's The Eternal Silence of These Infinite Spaces Makes Me Afraid, Pascal. Art historian Barbara Larson has noted that the artwork accords with those in des Esseintes' collection that are described as depicting prehistoric entities with apish bodies. Such a creature is here shown entirely alone in a desolate landscape on the edge of a blackened chasm. Its face looks up. The viewer's line of sight is deflected down into the darkness by the lines of the cloud and the slope, suggesting a moribund condition. It has been described as an image of existential anxiety. Redon is known to have taken inspiration from evolutionary theory, and this image is one such picture in which it is evident, displaying a creature somewhere along the evolutionary tree, seemingly alone at the end of its branch. Des Esseintes is of a similar condition. Then fertile heir to an aristocratic family, he, like the creature, is alone at the end of his line. The solitude that defines des Esseintes' condition on the outskirts of Paris is mirrored in Redon's images of cells. These aren't mentioned in Acherbeur, but given des Esseintes' fondness for Redon and his hallucinatory imagery, we can safely assume that works such as this one are sufficiently decadent. Moreover, they further illustrate the way in which visual art ran with themes that parallel those in literature and emphasize solitude, even if they aren't directly referenced in that literature. So here, Redon mobilizes the two meanings of the word cell, first as the basic unit of an organism, and second as a chamber within which one is contained. The being within the cell here is detached from the world outside and from the viewer as it appears in profile and accessible to our gaze. The surrounding environment appears chaotic in contrast to the evenly hued chamber. This also resonates with Des-Esseintes' worldview, as his turn to the interior and the artificial is in part predicated on his vision of nature as cruel and careless, influenced by Darwinian ideas of the survival of the fittest. Alone in his mansion, Des-Esseintes turns to images and objects for company. Two works which both solicit disgust and excitement are Gustave Moreau's treatments of the biblical princess Salome. The painter is here depicted as a femme fatale, and the misogyny that underlines this trope is bound up with arousal. Des-Esseintes, enraptured by the beauty of the painted woman and the visual splendor of the canvas, sexualizes her in frenzied run-on sentences. In Gustave Moreau's work, Salome had become, as it were, the symbolic incarnation of undying lust, the goddess of immortal hysteria, the accursed beauty exalted above all other beauties, poisoning everything that approaches her, everything that sees her, everything that she touches. And you'll notice in the painting, her hand actually approaches the contour of the seated king. And so his arousal is further confirmed by his identification with Herod, who you see seated. Like the old King Herod, Des-Esseintes invariably felt overwhelmed, subjugated, stunned when he looked at this dancing girl. This erotic simulation is a manifestation of the decadent preference for artifice over nature, and was neither limited to men, nor are the objects of passion necessarily figurative. In her 1900 novel, The Juggler, Rachel describes a decadent woman, Eliane Donalger, as being in love with a vase. Eliane was giving herself to the alabaster vase. Neither boy nor girl, she clenched her fingers a little, and she gave a small groan of imperceptible joy, the very breath of orgasm. Disconnected from humans and surrounded by collected objects of the utmost refinement, decadence embraced art, quite literally in Eliane's example. Lastly, I want to look at another image by Redon. Not only were his artworks described by Huysmans and Acribeau, but in 1888, Redon would translate Des-Esseintes into a frontispiece for the novel. Here, he reduces the decadent to his essentials. He is alone, sequestered not only within his house, but within the boundaries of the picture chair, where he gazes off to the side rather than connect to the viewer through a shared visual interaction. A decadent reader would, nonetheless, see themselves in this disconnection after opening the book and encountering this image privately. Having previously been defined by his ownership of Redon's artworks, amongst other things, Des-Esseintes has now himself become one, his lonesomeness confirmed and finalized by the artist's hand. As such, this picture epitomizes the interplay of art and literature in confirming solitude, singularity, and loneliness as features of the decadent individual and the preferred aesthetic. The over-refinement and perhaps self-obsession that these themes were predicated on did not go unnoticed by the contemporary observer. Max Nordau, while pathologizing the film du siècle in his 1892 book Degeneration, described both decadents and aesthetes as egomaniacs of the highest caliber. He writes that malformed nerves have given such individuals a morbidly exaggerated sense of self, causing them to perceive themselves as alone in the world. They are said to be pathologically antisocial. Though this section of his pseudo-medical treatise overlooks the visual arts, it is evident that they went hand in hand with literature in shaping the lonesome decadent at the end of the century. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I will pass this off to Elena, and she will present our next speaker.
Thank you, Nicholas, for the wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is Kayla Conklin. Kayla is an undergraduate student at the University of Maryland, majoring in art history and anthropology. She's interested in activism and protest art, especially that of queer and feminist protests in the 1980s. She will be presenting her paper, Treacherous Intimacy, Nan Goldin's Photography from the AIDS Epidemic. Welcome, Kayla.
Hi, everyone. Wow, what an amazing couple of panels. I am so proud to be up here with you. So let's see, without further ado, I will get the screen sharing rolling. Okay, can everyone see what they're supposed to see? The PowerPoint? Okay. All right, so I'll start my 10-minute timer here. I know this is the last presentation on the student panel, so I will keep it tight. My name is Kayla, as you heard in that wonderful introduction, and this presentation is titled Treacherous Intimacy, Nan Goldin's Photography from the AIDS Epidemic. This is, like some of my other peers, an excerpt from my senior honors thesis at the University of Maryland. So this research stems from a question about intimacy and the politics of stigmatizing illness. So through a visual and comparative analysis of Nan Goldin's photography, I seek to answer the question, how might 1980s photography represent the ways in which the politics of illness obstructs intimacy? So this bold and underline obstructs intimacy is really the center of this work. So allow me to plant us firmly into this 1980s moment of research here, right? Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States in this moment when New York City was beginning to be ravaged by this mysterious illness. Misinformation and stigma spread nearly as quickly, if not quicker, than the deadly new novel virus did. So we're going to take just about a minute to watch this very short clip from a film made by filmmaker Scott Colasino that shows what Deputy Press Secretary Larry Speakes had to say in response to the very first public question about AIDS. Please excuse if there's a short ad. Sometimes there is, then we'll see.
Your dry skin story changes from one day to the next. Try Eucerin Advanced Repair and switch. It doubles your skin's moisture and repairs dry skin over time. So tomorrow can be a different story. Eucerin, recommended and used by dermatologists.
Does the president have any reaction to the announcement of the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta that AIDS is now an epidemic, over 600 cases? And over a third of them are died. It's known as gay plague. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing that 1 in every 3 people that get this have died. And I wonder if the president is aware of it.
I don't have it. Are you? Do you?
You don't have it. Well, I'm relieved to hear that, Larry.
Do you?
No, I don't.
You didn't answer my question.
Well, I just wondered,
how do you know?
Does the president, in other words, the White House looks on this as a great joke?
No, I don't know anything about it, Lester.
Does anybody in the White House know about this epidemic, Larry?
I don't think so. I don't think there's been
Nobody
any.
knows.
There's been no personal experience here, Lester.
No, I mean, I thought you were keeping...
I checked thoroughly with Dr. Ruge this morning, and he's had no patient suffered from AIDS or whatever it is.
The president doesn't have gay plague. Is that what you're saying, or what?
No, didn't say that.
Didn't say it.
All right, so gay plague, gay cancer. These were the deeply homophobic terms that were used to stigmatize the virus and shift the onus of disease mitigation away from the government and towards people, further marginalizing queer communities and communities of color in the 1980s. Here we go. Okay. So I found that this fraught history of fear-mongering and kind of laughing off the virus is reflected in the visual record, resulting in a generation of artworks that represent isolation, loneliness, and an obstruction of intimacy. The image that you're looking at right now is an installation shot from the Museum of Modern Art's 2016 show titled Nan Goldin, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency. Nan Goldin was an East Village photographer from the 1980s, firmly planted in the LGBTQ community and this age of sex, drugs, and rock and roll that was really prevalent in the East Village in New York City. The Ballad of Sexual Dependency is a slideshow of about 700 photographs, which Goldin refers to as the diary I let people read. So this research looks closely at this one slide of this larger slideshow. It's titled Nan and Brian in Bed. And the visualization of the obstruction of intimacy is most clear in this image. We're looking at a self-portrait here. We see Nan Goldin on the right. She's the figure reclined in bed with this piercing gaze that's directed towards Brian, her lover and partner at the time. But despite this photograph being kind of clearly this sort of post-coital photograph, this lover's bond or emotional intimacy is missing here. There's this kind of disconnect, primarily potentially because Brian sits up in bed and turns away from Nan, creating a physical distance between the couple and kind of reading as an emotional distance as well. I think it's important to notice what's missing here, right? There's no warm embrace, there's no loving gaze, there's no like soft touch, right? We see two figures physically together within one frame, but kind of simultaneously isolated. My favorite piece of evidence in this photograph is the stark contrast of light and tone that we see right down the center. I have a little bit of an illustration here. You'll notice, I'll kind of toggle back and forth, that the light creates a line against that back wall. And that line of contrast and of light splits the two figures, kind of relegates them into their own space. We might think of this as a yin and yang symbol of sorts. So I have the yin yang symbol here for just so you can to help visualize it. Imagine, right, that there's these two planes of color, there's color and tone in the photograph, a light and a dark. Brian, who is the most, like the brightest point of the image, resides in the dark half, and Nan Golden, robed in a dark drapery, dark robe, kind of is residing in this brightly lit half of the composition. So let's consider the connections to this yin yang symbol, which is a Chinese symbol for balance and harmony, and the ways in which this photograph challenges notions of heterosexual harmony and balance. Because this photograph is really a moment where this private moment of disconnection is being publicized. So now let's remember what I mentioned before, that the Ballad of Sexual Dependency is a series of 700 photographs. So I think it's really important to place Nan and Brian in bed, the previous image, in context with some of the other images that you would have been seeing had you seen the original slideshow. So this is Nan and Brian in bed in kimono, and it's kind of clearly shot within only moments of the previous photograph. Once again, each figure is relegated to their own half of the image. There's that same stark line of contrast that runs down the center. And look closely this time at the posture and positioning of the figures. Nan Golden comes closer to the picture frame, the picture plane, than she did in the previous image. And in doing so, takes up far more space, nearly crowding Brian off the frame, which might nod to some themes of power, like taking back power, and some, if we were to read this with some feminist lenses. So we're looking at this moment of vulnerability. As Nan Golden writes in her book, which is also titled The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, men and women are irrevocably misaligned. And I think that that is really key to reading these images as a comment about power and harmony and balance and right, this irrevocable misalliance between heterosexual couples, especially in the 1980s. So considering these photographs were captured in 1983 in the East Village of New York City, it's easy to see connections between sexual misalliance and the erupting AIDS epidemic. The queer bedroom was no longer a private or an intimate space. Now, clearly this is a heterosexual couple, one might assume, but some sources write that Nan Golden identifies as bisexual and just kind of like ran in these circles. So in this moment when the queer bedroom was no longer a private or an intimate space because public policy and social stigma was permeating what was allowed or disallowed in the bedroom, this photograph responds to this moment of social unrest. So I would like to leave you all with a return to the contemporary. While Reagan's administration deemed HIV/AIDS the gay plague or gay cancer, the Trump administration coined terms like Kung flu and Chinese virus. The parallels are disturbing, where queer bodies were both politicized and allowed to perish in the 1980s. The Asian body, in many cases, are treated in a remarkably similar fashion today with the COVID-19 pandemic. These are bodies that are victims of government-sanctioned violence, all because of racist or homophobic misinformation that leads to isolation and this kind of misalliance, right, that Nan Golden draws on. So in conclusion, I urge us all to take a lesson from the past and not fall victim to this idea of COVID-19 being an unprecedented phenomenon. These are issues that have cropped up in the past and allow us to reflect on why we might fear certain bodies more than others and what the mental health implications are of treating others as dirty or unworthy of care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla, for your amazing presentation, as well as Nicholas. So we will open the floor to questions now. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat below if you don't feel comfortable just using your mic.
Oh, we have a question in the chat. So Victoria asks, both of your presentations touch on the intimate sphere being brought into the public sphere. Where do you feel we can learn from this in our current pandemic situation? Both of you, this is open for both of you.
I can start us off. I think that kind of my conclusion really speaks on this, and like remembering that like I don't know, unpacking what unprecedented moment really means, right? Like not falling victim to making the same mistakes over and over again. I guess as historians, that's our responsibility, right? To publicize that these are mistakes that have been made in the past. I think that especially in this quarantine moment, right? Like in the 1980s, nobody was quarantining in their homes for like long periods like we have been for the last year. But I think that maybe something that's different now that from the AIDS epidemic is these spheres. I think you draw on this really interesting idea of the public and the private sphere, as like the public sphere being kind of like this point of like danger, and there's you know, risk as soon as you leave the front door of your home, and maybe like seeing a clearer line drawn in the sand today.
Yeah, that's great. I think with mine, I guess how I kind of think about that is when you think about the pandemic, right? It's always like you're supposed to kind of act as if you have it, even if you don't know if you do. You're just kind of like presume you have the virus just to keep everyone else safe is the kind of thought process. And with Alfred Desessance is sort of a weird character in that he kind of hates the entire world, but also he's kind of everything he hates in the world is himself, and he's like racked with sickness and illness, and so it's kind of a similar situation where he kind of quarantines himself to like escape the world, but he can't escape himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's well said response, both of you. And of course, like your two topics are very relevant even now. And I almost wonder like if the timing was so great to be presenting these essays now. Oh, and Dr. Saperstein also says fantastic work.
I actually have a question for Nicholas. I find like Arabor really interesting in the sense of like how materialism and decadence mediates his isolation, or maybe even kind of expounds it. So I wonder if you see any parallels in kind of contemporary popular culture that kind of really idolizes consumption and hyperconsumption and that kind of thing. If you see parallels in how that might isolate our relationships between each other, especially class-wise and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think because Desessance kind of materialism is a very kind of weird materialism, and that it's very niche, and he doesn't really like, he hates the bourgeoisie, like he really despises anyone who's not an aristocrat, really. He has some sympathy for lower class people, but it's kind of a reserved sympathy. And so his kind of materialism is kind of the point of departure for his isolation, and that he really kind of constructs himself as being just like hyper refined, sophisticated type individual. And so it kind of resonates today, but it kind of is often its own thing at the same time, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah.
So we have a question in the chat from Jean-Luc, and he asked Nicholas, can you expand more on the ideas of individuality, aloneness, and a sense of disconnect? And can you expand more upon the notion of the ideal artistic world? That's a great question.
Yeah, so I mean, like I kind of been getting at, I guess this kind of ideal decadent figure is sort of hyper individuated in a way that's kind of not actually like tameable, because as much as he's sort of this hyper individual, he's also kind of a model, I guess, for a certain type of movement or person in this period. And so as much as he's an individual, he's sort of not an individual. But yeah, and so I guess that kind of gets on what you're getting with that, and the loneliness and disconnection as well. The ideal artistic world bit is kind of interesting in that he himself isn't necessarily an artist in the very kind of narrow definition we typically use. Like, he doesn't make anything, he doesn't paint, he doesn't write, he simply consumes stuff. But in the way he kind of models his kind of artificial world into his own kind of retreat, it is something kind of artistry about that, perhaps. And with Knopf, who I didn't touch on too much, but I kind of brought up a little bit in the essay, one thing about him that's kind of interesting is that in his artworks, there's these kind of symbols which kind of repeat over and over again. Like, there's this head in the painting I put up, I don't know if you noticed it, that it's going to appear in a few paintings of his. So it's kind of like his ideal artistic world is sort of this kind of self-indulgent, contained thing, if that makes sense.
So if we don't have any more questions, I don't see any in the chat. We'll take a very short break until 3 o'clock, and then we'll come back and we'll have a presentation from our keynote speaker, Dr. Jordan Bear.
No problem. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.